Guys, we're going to show you how to change the pump seal today on this AC Plus. It's an Ampco pump and it's pretty common. Sometimes it gets seized on there a little bit. And that one came off pretty easily. You always want to inspect inside for any scratching, just to see if the impeller is rubbing inside. But that looks to be in pretty good shape. Take that there. Next thing you're going to do is take off this guard right here. That belongs with it. So first thing we're going to do is loosen the spring with this Allen key right here. See, all you have to do is loosen that set screw a little bit, and then see, now that spring should relax, but it's stuck. It's a little bit seized. So we'll take off the impeller here. There we go. Sometimes that gets seized on there a little bit, and it can be a little bit tricky to take off. Notice that the impeller nut has a gasket. It's important not to forget that when you're putting it back together. So the impeller comes off, and you'll notice, you'll want to zoom in a little bit, but on the shaft, on the stub of the impeller, there's a little pocket for this key stock right here. So that actually fits right inside there. And the impeller has a little slot that will line up with that key stock when you put it back together. So pay attention to that and don't lose that little piece. The faceplate has these two hooks which made up with these two rods, and you put them in and spin and it locks that in place. Another small gasket. So there's the O-ring in the back. This actually looks to be in pretty good shape. Not too bad. When you compare it to the new one, it looks very similar. So next we have a little collar and a spring that works in conjunction to keep the seal compressed. So let's loosen this guy. Actually remove that completely from the shaft just by loosening this lock collar here. As you tighten that, it tightens that down onto the stub shaft.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
There you go.
You can see the marks on the shaft where the set screws were holding it on. Yeah. So this piece, typically you won't have to change anything unless there's something really wrong with that. But in this case, it looks to be in pretty good shape. So when you're putting all this together, what you'll notice is this little groove right here and this little groove right here, they go together. So these three spots line up, and that little spot has to line up with that little spot when you compress it with the spring. Spring, this goes in the spring, and then when you compress the seal, that little spot has to be able to line up. So So if those aren't lined up and oriented properly, then it's not going to seal for you. So pay attention to that. But that is basically how we take it apart. And you would just inspect everything to make sure it's clean. The shaft looks good. Everything looks good. Usually on a leaking pump, you would be able to find some kind of evidence. Either the O-ring would have a cut or a tear, or there would be a chip in the carbon face. In this case, everything looks fine. But since we're already here, we'll put the new one in.
Okay.
And you can keep this for a rainy day. So, put that back on there. That will go on there. And now you don't know where to put that yet, because what we have to do is set the gap on the impeller. So we'll set the gap on the impeller, and once we're happy with it, then we'll tighten that. So you'll see about that. So that guy goes there, he's on there. And then what you can do just to set that gap is you put this faceplate on, and then you twist that, and you see how those engage. So that is now on. And then what you do is you take the impeller, you thread that on all the way down. Because we didn't tighten that lock collar, it still moves, right? And so this is called gapping the impeller. And typically what you're going to do, you can use a set of feeler gauges, but since I've done this 1,000 times, I know that it has to sit about right there. So if you look at the gap between the faceplate and the impeller, you don't want it to be touching. You don't want it to be out there. You want it to be about the thickness of 2 paper width, so that it's almost touching. And in some spots it's tighter than others, so look at the tightest spot and then use that. So once you're happy with that gap that you have, that's when you tighten this lock collar right here. So you get that till it's almost snug. You double check that you're happy with the gap. And you tighten that up. And now it doesn't move anymore. And so you just want to rotate it to check that it's not rubbing. Right? That's a good gap. I like that. Snug this up. You can pull this back off. And now we have gapped the impeller. So we'll go ahead and put the seal back together. And we should be good to go. There's that. That comes off. This guy goes back on. We'll let him float for now, because what we'll do is we'll put the seal on, put the plate on, and then we'll pull this up to it and tighten it. So that guy's there. This is the old one. We're going to use the new one. So now we're going to take a bit of food grade sanitary lubrication. Just get a little bit on your finger, and we'll do the O-ring. This O-ring belongs on the back side of the stationary seal. It goes in this little pocket right here. You just press that in. Make sure it's nice and flat. The important thing when you're handling this is that you keep this carbon face clean. You don't want any grit or dust or grime or anything on that carbon face. It's super delicate to dirt and also damage and crack it very easily. So make sure that's nice and clean. Let's pop that guy in there. And then we have our new spring. Actually, we can put this all on as once so that we can line it up. Because remember, this has the slot and the little groove. So these go together. Make sure that those are lined up. Yes, they line up good. So that's how they go on the shaft. So that's fine. And you just need to take care when you're pushing that O-ring over the shaft, because you can tear the O-ring. So you just need to be careful when you do that. Make sure that those stay lined up. So that's good. So you'll notice the little groove on the end of the shaft. And this is quite important actually. There's a groove on the end of the shaft, and you notice this O-ring, one side has a raised face and one side is flat. I don't know if you can see that. So the raised face lines up with the groove. So make sure you put the groove into the raised face. So that sits there. Now this is our last chance to inspect that hard carbon face for any grit or grime. And you can see that there's a little bit of residue on there from the lubrication. Kind of hard to see. But what I'll do at this last chance is I'll just clean it up a little bit if I can. Because you don't want anything on there. And sometimes you can use lacquer thinner, acetone, or mineral spirits, and you can clean that up if you need to, and that won't damage the seal at all. So we've got our seal together, we've got our O-ring in there. We're going to put this guy in. That guy right there. We're going to put our plate back on. It's always a good idea to have a look and see if there's any wear anywhere. This looks like it's in pretty good shape. Get a little wipe down, but I'm happy with that. Check that these are tight. Sometimes these will thread themselves out. You can see that one moves a little bit. So they need to be opposite of each other so that when you twist it, they grab. That in, twist. You want to make sure that those fully engage. Okay. Now this is when you have to compress the spring, and you want these two slots to line up like we discussed. This can be sometimes a little bit tricky. We'll thread this on first because it kind of gives the plate a little bit more rigidity. Put that in. Make sure we line up the groove. And see, that's not going to go any further than that gap that we set, right? Make sure we have our gasket on the back of the impeller nut. Going to do that snug for now. Now we should be able to compress this a little bit easier maybe. It certainly is a little bit tricky. Feels like you need 3 hands sometimes. But the idea is you get that all the way snug. So if you can see now, that groove and that little nub are together, right? So if that's not all the way pressed in, then you're going to want to loosen it off and try it again. And don't forget the other set screw like I did the first time. So those have to be quite tight. And that's like what you were saying. The seal could be fine, but if those screws loosen and then that spring backs off a little bit, it's not putting pressure on the sealing face, and then it could leak that way. And then that's how you'll see water coming out of the bottom there. So, always good to have a close look at that. Make sure that you're happy with everything. That's okay. We'll snug this up again just to make sure. Here. Okay, so that's nice and tight. Now we'll put our guard back on. So this has two little clips that they just have to fit right inside. So kind of just hold that at the bottom with one hand. That's good. Now we just put the pump housing back on. So what you do is once you get that somewhat snug, then you can tap that around, right? So I'll just tap it till it's level. Normally you can put a torpedo level on there to check that it's good to go, but in this case it's probably fine. And there we have it. New seal installed.